There is this really persistent, almost universally accepted assumption we make whenever we open an ancient religious text.
Right, the allegorical reflex.
Exactly. We just assume we are stepping into this realm of the poetic. Like, it's all metaphors. You read a passage about the heavens or the creation of life or the mountains, and the standard reflex is to just filter it through this lens of spirituality.
Yeah, the scholar points to the text and basically says, do not take this literally. It's just an allegory for the soul.
Right, and it's a deeply ingrained defensive posture, really.
Yeah.
By categorizing these texts entirely as spiritual poetry, we just insulate them from empirical scrutiny. We build a firewall.
We do. We say, well, science operates over here in the laboratory dealing with hard, measurable reality, and ancient philosophy operates way over there in the temple dealing with comforting, subjective truths.
Yeah, because if you treat ancient texts as literal descriptions of physical reality, historically, they usually collapse immediately under the weight of modern science.
Oh, instantly.
Right. But, and this is the crux of today's deep dive, what happens when you strip away that defensive posture? What happens when an ancient text does not just survive empirical scrutiny, but actually goes on the offensive?
That is the million-dollar question for you listening right now.
Yeah. When it actively rejects that allegorical firewall and challenges you to use the scientific method, the actual observation of physical systems, to prove its validity.
It creates this intellectual whiplash that fundamentally destabilizes how we view the history of human thought. You're suddenly forced to deal with a text not as a collection of Sunday school moralities, but as a deeply sophisticated structural analysis of reality.
Which brings us to the exact center of today's deep dive. We're looking at notes from a profoundly dense, paradigm-shifting lecture delivered back in October 1987.
A phenomenal piece of source material.
Truly. The text under the microscope is the Quran, specifically starting around Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse 60. And the analytical framework here is strictly empirical. We aren't doing dogmatic theology today.
No, not at all. We were looking at this brilliant synthesis of linguistics, modern astrophysics, biology, and this is crucial socioeconomic systems.
Yeah, and that framework is vital for you, the listener, to keep in mind. The objective here isn't to ask you to accept a set of religious beliefs. This is a rigorous intellectual exploration. We are analyzing an argument about systems, evidence, and language.
We are going to look at how ancient Arabic linguistic roots, words spoken in a 7th century desert environment, somehow map with microscopic precision onto 20th century scientific discoveries.
That's wild.
And simultaneously offer this devastating critique of human authority.
So I want to start exactly where the lecture starts, because it perfectly captures a tension that feels just as relevant today as it did in 1987. The lecture describes this societal crisis of evidence.
Right, the youth demanding receipts.
Exactly. You have this younger generation, students immersed in modern education, who understand the scientific method, who study physics and biology, and they go to traditional religious scholars with a very straightforward demand. They're saying, give us logical, empirical proof that this text is what it claims to be.
Which is, the inevitable result of teaching a generation to hypothesize, observe, and verify. When a student is trained to demand mathematical proof for the laws of thermodynamics...
Yeah, they're going to apply that same standard to philosophy.
Absolutely. They are naturally going to apply that exact same epistemic standard. They are no longer satisfied with inherited dogmas. They want to see the underlying architecture.
But the tragedy, as the source points out, is the traditional response. When these students ask for empirical proof, what do the clerics do? They panic.
They get defensive.
Right, they resort to anger. The material describes these traditionalists turning red in the face, shutting down the inquiry, and instantly labeling the curious youth as infidels or heretics. Their entire counter-argument just boils down to stop asking questions and submit to blind faith.
And this is where the lecturer performs this magnificent intellectual pivot. He points out the supreme irony of the cleric's position. The traditionalist is demanding blind faith to protect the text. But if you actually read the text, it fundamentally rejects blind faith.
It actively mocks it.
Yes, it mocks the idea of believing something without empirical evidence.
That blew my mind. The text is essentially saying, do not just take my word for it. Instead of demanding internal submission, it points the reader completely outward. It points to the outer universe and to the mechanics of human biology.
Let's look exactly at how it does this, because it completely explodes the standard theological reading of this material. The lecturer focuses heavily on verse 27.60. Now, traditionally...
I know this one.
Yeah, traditionally this verse is presented as a classic cosmological argument for the existence of God.
Right, the whole look at the beautiful universe, therefore a creator exists.
Exactly. It's treated like this generic feel-good sermon. Look at the trees. God is great.
But the lecturer just refuses that framing entirely.
Completely. Because that reading reduces an incredibly sharp, intellectually dense argument into a platitude. The verse is not asking, does a creator exist? That isn't the primary question being contested in the socio-economic context of the text.
Right.
The actual question being contested is, who has legitimate authority over the productive systems of the earth?
Okay, wait, let's unpack this for the listener. How do we get from look at the sky to a critique of socioeconomic authority?
By looking at the precise linguistic chain in the verse. It's not a poem, it's a systems audit. The verse runs through the entire productive chain of the natural order. It asks, Aman khlaka as-samawati wal ard.
Meaning, who created the structural systems of the heavens and earth?
Notice it is talking about physical architecture, not spiritual realms.
Right.
Then it moves to the hydraulic system, wa anzala lakomina asameman, and sent down for you water from the sky.
Okay, so that's a pre-installed water cycle.
Exactly. No human engineered the evaporation and precipitation mechanics. Then the verse moves to the biological productivity chain, فَأَنبَتْنَا بِهِ حَدَائِقَ بَجَاتٍ, and grew thereby gardens of delight or flourishing ecological systems.
So you have water inputs, soil chemistry, plant growth, aesthetic output.
All of it. And then comes the hammer blow, the most direct political and economic statement in the sequence.
Oh, I love this part.
It says, Makana lakum an tunbitu shajaraha. You had no capacity to grow its trees.
You had no capacity. It is pointing directly at the human claimant.
Precisely. The text is confronting the landowner, the feudal lord, the colonial administrator, the corporate monopoly, whoever is currently claiming total authority over the productive land.
Right. It's pointing at the soil microbiome, the photosynthesis mechanism, the hydrological cycle, and asking, did you build this?
Did you design this? Did you install this infrastructure? And the undeniable empirical answer is always no. You did not.
So therefore, your claim to absolute ownership or absolute authority is a categorical error.
Exactly. You are claiming credit for a system you fundamentally do not understand and did not build.
So the verse ends with this phrase that I have always seen translated as, is there a God besides God? And usually that's where the conversation stops. It's just framed as monotheism versus polytheism, like don't worship statues.
And that is exactly where the translation betrays the depth of the text. The Arabic phrase is A ilahun ma Allahi, bal hum qawmun yadilun. The critical word here is yadilun.
Yadilun. Okay, what does that actually mean?
The lecturer explains that this does not just mean worshiping other gods in some primitive ritualistic sense. The root of yadilun means to equate, to treat as equivalent things that are fundamentally not equivalent.
What are they equating? What's the error?
They are conflating partial control with total authority. This is the intellectual error the text is targeting. Think about it. Someone who holds a water right, who controls an irrigation channel, did not build the hydrological cycle.
Right, they just tapped into it.
Someone who holds a title deed to a farm did not engineer the seed germination mechanism. But the social and political architecture of almost every unjust human system is built on exactly this conflation.
Wow.
Those who control a tiny downstream piece of the productive system claim the authority of the one who designed the entire system.
They equate their management of the system with the creation of the system.
Exactly. That conflation, Yadalun, is the systemic error being named here. It's not just a theological dispute about the names of deities in the sky. It is a structural critique of how human beings falsely legitimize their power over one another.
It's an engine of reason dismantling tyranny through basic observation, which ties perfectly into what the lecture called the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
A systemic consequence.
Right, the idea that every authority structure built on this false claim, the claim that the controller of a system is its creator, will eventually be exposed. The gap between their claim and their actual capacity will crush them.
The lecture connects this to the broader arc of the Surah. Pharaoh claimed he made the Nile flow. The elite of Thamud claimed authority over the land without having built the productive systems that made that land viable.
And in every case, the requital is the same. The claim fails under the pressure of its own internal contradiction.
It's a massive paradigm shift. The text uses perceptual knowledge, what you can see and measure, like rain and agriculture, to build conceptual knowledge about the illegitimacy of human tyranny.
So if the text itself invites this intense empirical scrutiny of the physical universe, the next logical question is, who have actually taken up that challenge using modern scientific metrics.
Right. Who did the math?
Exactly. And this brings us to a key figure in our source material, Dr. Maurice Bucaille.
Yes, Bucaille, a highly trained French physician and surgeon who authored this profoundly influential book called The Bible, the Quran, and Science. The 1987 lecture leans heavily on his methodology because Bucaille did exactly what the text demanded. He brought the receipts.
But I have to ask, why did a 20th century French surgeon decide to put ancient texts under a microscope? What was his baseline assumption going into this?
Well, he approached this strictly as a scientist. He was a supreme skeptic, but he was committed to intellectual fairness. His premise was straightforward. He wanted to analyze ancient religious texts to see how they held up against firmly established modern science.
Firmly established.
Right, not theoretical science, not hypotheses that might be overturned in a decade, but undeniable, proven scientific facts.
And his operating assumption, which, makes total sense, was that any text written by human beings in antiquity is going to reflect the scientific ignorance of antiquity.
Exactly. Historically, ancient human philosophies always contain a mix. They might have a few brilliant, intuitive leaps that seem ahead of their time, but those are inevitably weighed down by monumental, scientifically invalid errors. An ancient philosopher might make a lucky guess about atoms, but in the next paragraph, they'll confidently assert that disease is caused by an imbalance of bile, or that the sun is pulled across the sky by a literal chariot.
Right. They are inextricably bound by the limitations of their era.
So Bucaille decides to apply this strict, unforgiving scientific audit to the Quran. He goes in specifically looking for those inevitable scientific blunders.
And the lecture details his absolute shock here. When Bucaille went through the text, auditing its statement on biology, geology, and astrophysics, he could not find a single statement that contradicted modern established science. Not one.
It's a staggering statistical anomaly. It forced Bucaille to completely pause his worldview. But to execute this audit properly, he realized he had a massive methodological obstacle.
Yeah, he couldn't just walk into a Parisian bookstore, pick up a French translation, and start his analysis.
No, because if you're testing the scientific accuracy of a text, you can't rely on a translator who might not understand the science themselves.
Why did Bucaille feel compelled to spend years mastering ancient Arabic just to read this text?
This is a huge focus of the lecture, and it raises a critical point about the mechanics of translation. Translations are inherently flawed, especially when dealing with highly compressed, complex, ancient languages.
Right.
Historically, when a translator encounters a word that has multiple deep meanings, they have to choose one. And how do they choose? They default to the scientific understanding of the era in which they, the translator, are living.
Let me see if I can map an analogy onto this for the listener.
Yeah.
Imagine you are reading a translated science fiction novel.
Okay.
Let's say the original author understood complex quantum physics and wrote a highly technical description of a warp drive. But the translator, living 100 years earlier, has absolutely no concept of quantum physics.
Right. It's outside their paradigm.
They look at the original word, get totally confused by the context, and translate it as a really fast horse.
That is a perfect analogy.
If you, the modern reader, read that translated version, you're going to think the original author was primitive. You'll think, wow, this guy thought you could travel between stars on a horse. To get the real mind-blowing meaning, you have to bypass the translator and read the original language.
Exactly. Bucaille realized that traditional commentaries and translations from the 12th century or the 15th century were unintentionally injecting their own scientific limitations into the text.
They were just doing their best with what they knew.
Right, but they were trapped in their time. To find out what the text actually claimed, Bucaille had to strip away centuries of human commentary. He had to go straight to the raw, original Arabic roots. Look at the etymology of the words in their purest form before later human assumptions got layered over them.
And this is where the lecture shifts from theory to concrete evidence. We start getting into these specific examples of what I like to think of as linguistic time capsules.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, these words that have been sitting locked in the text for 1,400 years, just waiting for the right scientific era, the right technological key to unlock their true meaning. The first major example we have to look at is astrophysics. It's about the stars and planetary motion.
Right. The lecture directs us to verses discussing the movement of celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the alternation of day and night. And the lecturer specifically points out how outdated translations handled this movement.
Yeah, the old commentators translated the movement of these celestial bodies as floating or spinning inside a sphere.
Which perfectly reflects the cosmological consensus of the ancient world.
Yeah.
In the 7th century, and frankly for many centuries after, human beings had absolutely no concept of an orbit occurring in a vacuum.
The prevailing belief was the Ptolemaic system, right?
Yes. They thought the sky was a literal solid dome or a series of concentric, transparent crystal spheres. They believed the stars and planets were physically embedded in these spheres, and the spheres rotated, pushing the planets along.
They thought space was a mechanical filled structure. They could not conceive of an object moving through an empty void by its own momentum.
Precisely. So when the early translators encountered the Arabic words describing the movement of the sun and moon, their brains automatically defaulted to their crystal sphere bias. They translated it to mean floating along with the dome.
But then Bucay isolates the original Arabic root word used to describe this specific celestial movement. The word is yazbahun. It stems from the three-letter root SBH. When Bucay bypassed the old translations and looked purely at the linguistic mechanics of this root, what did he find?
He found a level of scientific precision that simply shouldn't exist in antiquity. The root SBH does not mean passively floating, like a piece of dead wood being carried down a river.
Okay.
It does not mean being dragged or pushed by an external force, like a planet stuck in a crystal dome. The fundamental linguistic meaning of this root is to move by one's own internal power or momentum.
Wait, really? It specifically implies a self-generated internal kinetic energy.
Yes. If you applied this root word to a human being in a body of water, it translates as swimming. It means you are using your own limbs, your own internal biomechanical energy, to propel yourself forward through a medium. If you apply it to a horse on land, it means galloping, moving forward through your own muscular force.
Let that sink in. When you take that pure linguistic definition, moving through a space driven by internal power and momentum, and you apply it to celestial bodies, you've just perfectly described modern orbital mechanics.
Exactly.
Planets and moons aren't being dragged by invisible strings. They aren't stuck in a physical dome. They're hurtling through the vacuum of space, driven by their own internal kinetic energy and momentum, locked in their specific gravitational orbits.
It's like the difference between a leaf floating down a stream, which is the ancient view, and a nuclear submarine navigating under its own power, which is the Yazbahan view. The word captures the exact kinetic reality of an orbit.
And this leads the lecturer to pose a devastating impossibility argument. This is the core empirical challenge. He asks the listener to step back and calculate the probability.
Right, the statistical likelihood.
Yeah. How could a man living in the Arabian desert in the 7th century, surrounded by a culture that had no telescopes, no mathematical concept of gravity, no understanding of a vacuum, how could he possibly bypass the accepted crystal dome theory of the greatest minds of his era and choose the one specific linguistic root that flawlessly captures the kinetic mechanics of celestial orbits?
It defies statistical probability. You have a menu of thousands of verbs to describe movement in Arabic, and the text selects the exact one that won't be proven scientifically accurate until astrophysicists map the solar system a millennium later.
And remember the context of the translation trap. The author couldn't have just guessed based on the prevailing wisdom of the day, because the prevailing wisdom was fundamentally mechanically wrong.
If the text was simply a product of a human mind in the 7th century, it would have used a word that meant embedded in a dome. The fact that it deliberately avoids the scientific error of its era is what stopped Bucay in his tracks.
Okay, predicting the exact mechanics of orbital momentum from the ground is astounding. But the source material pushes the boundary even further. Because the text doesn't just look up at the stars from a distance, it actually talks about the physical and psychological experience of traveling to them.
We are moving from the physics of the cosmos to the biology of human spaceflight.
Yes, this is a fascinating transition in the lecture. We look at Surah 15, specifically verses 14 and 15. The text sets up a hypothetical scenario for the reader.
Yeah.
It asks, what if a door were opened in the sky and people ascending, kept climbing up through it, higher and higher?
Let's contextualize how bizarre this question would have been to an ancient audience. How did the classical commentators interpret this hypothetical door in the sky?
They were incredibly confused by the verses that followed, because to the ancient mind, going up into the sky simply meant getting closer to the sun.
Right.
And getting closer to the sun should mean the environment gets increasingly brighter, hotter, and more blindingly radiant. It should be an experience of overwhelming light.
That is the perfectly logical assumption of anyone standing on the surface of the Earth. But let's look at the exact reaction the text predicts. You have the translation there, right?
I do. The text says that if human beings were to ascend continuously through this door in the sky, their reaction would be, quote, they would say, our eyes have been dazzled or intoxicated, or rather, we are a people bewitched.
Intoxicated or bewitched. They feel like they're under a magical spell. Their senses are completely betraying them. Now let's map that ancient description onto modern scientific reality. What actually happens physically and visually when an astronaut leaves the Earth's atmosphere?
Well, it is the exact opposite of what the ancients assumed. Down here on the ground, the sky is bright blue because of a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering. The gases in our atmosphere scatter the sun's electromagnetic radiation, bouncing the blue light in every direction.
Precisely. But what happens the moment a spacecraft punches through that thin atmospheric layer and enters the vacuum of space?
The scattering stops instantly. Because there is no atmosphere to bounce the light, the environment around the spacecraft plunges into absolute pitch-black darkness.
Even though you are physically closer to the sun.
Yes, the sky isn't bright, space is an abyss. The sun just looks like a piercing, unfiltered spotlight in a void of nothingness.
And how perfectly does this align with the documented accounts of modern astronauts? If you read the memoirs of the Apollo crews or the astronauts on the International Space Station, they describe this exact sensory shock, the sudden, jarring transition from the familiar bright blue sky to an incomprehensible deep black.
It completely disrupts the human sensory baseline.
It does. The feeling of extreme disorientation, the feeling that your eyes must be playing tricks on you, the visual intoxication. The text is describing a phenomenon, the sudden darkness and psychological disorientation of leaving the atmosphere that was entirely unknown, untestable, and unexperienceable until the mid-20th century.
It flawlessly captures the psychological and visual reality of extra-atmospheric spaceflight.
But I have to push back here for a second, because a skeptic might say, okay, that's a brilliant poetic description of confusion, but it's just a hypothetical metaphor. If a door opened, the text doesn't actually believe human beings are going to build rockets and go up there, right?
Oh, that is exactly the pushback the lecturer anticipates. And he answers it by diving into a deeply embedded grammatical nuance.
The grammar of possibility.
Yes. The text doesn't just treat space travel as a poetic metaphor, it actually encodes it as a future engineering reality.
Okay, walk me through this grammar. We are looking at Surah Ar-Rahman, where the text issues a direct challenge to humans and jinn to pass beyond the bounds or the regions of the heavens and the earth.
Right, and this requires a brief but vital lesson in ancient Arabic grammar. The lecture points out that there are two distinct ways to say the word if in Arabic, and the choice of word completely dictates the reality of the sentence.
Let's unpack the linguistic trap. What's the first word for if?
The first word is law. LAW law is used for a strict, impossible hypothetical. It's employed when you are describing a situation that cannot and mathematically will not ever happen.
For example?
Like if I were a bird, I would fly to the moon. You are fundamentally not a bird and you never will be. The premise is physically impossible. That's law.
Got it. Impossible. A fairy tale if.
The second word is in. I-N. In is used for a conditional situation that is practically and physically possible. It implies that the event hasn't happened yet, but the potential for it to happen exists firmly within the realm of reality.
So if it rains tomorrow, the crops will grow. It might not rain, but it is entirely within the realm of physical mechanics.
Exactly. So the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
When the Quran poses this challenge about humanity one day escaping the bounds of the earth and traveling to space, which if does it use?
That is the crux of the empirical argument. The text uses in. It explicitly rejects the use of law. By consciously choosing in, the text is grammatically and structurally encoding the possibility of space travel. It is telling a 7th century nomadic audience, you have not achieved this yet, but it is a physical possibility for your species.
It treats space travel not as a magical fantasy, but as an engineering problem, waiting for humanity to solve it.
And speaking of engineering, there is a very specific caveat attached to that challenge in the verse. It says you can potentially pass beyond the earth, but you cannot do it except by sultan.
Sultan. This is another word that fell victim to the translation trap, didn't it?
Absolutely. Historically, classical commentators really struggled with this word in this specific context. They usually translated it vaguely as authority or permission from God, treating it entirely as a theological or spiritual barrier.
Right, because they couldn't conceive of humans building a machine to get up there. So if someone asked, how do we pass the bounds of the earth, the cleric would say, only if God grants you spiritual permission.
But Bucay rejects that. How does a French scientist jump from an ancient word for authority to a physical engineering requirement?
By doing what Bucay always does. Going back to the raw etymological root, the word sultan later evolved into a political title, a king or ruler. But its original linguistic root in 7th century Arabic means immense, concentrated power, a piercing, dominant force, or advanced technological capability.
So let's synthesize that. We have a 7th century text using a specific grammatical structure, in, to predict that escaping Earth's gravity is theoretically possible for humanity. But it explicitly states that to achieve this, it will require a sultan, an immense concentrated output of physical dominant power.
Which is the exact functional definition of a rocket engine cutting through the atmosphere.
Yes.
It requires a violent, highly concentrated dominance over the force of gravity. Achieving escape velocity requires sultan.
I mean, you read the analysis of that sequence and it just gives you chills. A society riding camels across the desert is being told, you can leave the planet, but you are going to need an unbelievable amount of concentrated physical energy to break the atmospheric barrier.
That isn't theology. That is a physics and engineering blueprint hidden inside ancient grammar.
And what makes the lecture's broader argument so compelling is that this flawless scientific track record isn't just limited to the macro. The text subjects itself to the exact same rigorous empirical scrutiny on the micro level.
Right. If the text can accurately describe the vacuum of space, what happens when it looks inward? This brings us to the biology of human origins.
Yes, we are zooming all the way in from the cosmos to the womb. The lecture heavily features Bucay's findings regarding human embryology as described in the text. And Bucay, being a surgeon and a medical doctor, was uniquely positioned to audit this specific material.
He was captivated by it. He analyzed the specific verses that outline the sequential stages of embryo development in the womb. And what he found was microscopic precision that simply should not exist prior to the invention of the electron microscope.
Before we get into what the text says, we need to set the historical baseline. We need to know what the smartest people in the ancient world thought about reproduction. Because if we look at the greatest minds of antiquity, someone like Aristotle, the absolute father of Western logic and science, his theories on human reproduction were, frankly, bizarre.
They were wildly incorrect. Aristotle, who influenced scientific thought for over a millennium, believed in what is basically a cheese coagulation theory.
Cheese coagulation?
Yeah. He posited that the male semen provided the form, or the spiritual blueprint, and the female menstrual blood provided the physical matter. He believed these two substances simply mixed in the womb and coagulated together to form a human, much like Renette coagulates milk into cheese.
That was the prevailing science. And there were other theories too, right?
Yes. Later on, even great physicians like Galen had massive anatomical errors. And for centuries, many cultures believed in the homunculus theory.
Oh, right, the tiny man.
Yeah, the idea that an entirely fully formed miniature human being was curled up inside a single sperm cell, and the mother's womb was merely an incubator that allowed the miniature human to grow larger.
The scientific consensus of the ancient world was completely divorced from the actual biological reality of cellular division, implantation, and embryology.
So you have all these ancient, brilliant human minds making massive foundational blunders because they lack the technology to see what's actually happening. But then Bucay looks at the Quran sequence. Walk us through the specific stages the text outlines.
The text outlines a highly specific, chronologically accurate sequence. It starts with the nutfa, a drop of mingled fluid, referencing the precise combination of male and female genetic material, completely bypassing Aristotle's blood coagulation theory.
Right out of the gate, it's more accurate.
Yes. Then it moves to a stage called the alaka.
And alaka is where the microscopic precision really starts to show, right? How is that word usually translated?
It's often translated as a clinging entity, or, fascinatingly, a leech-like structure.
A leech? Why a leech?
Because it perfectly describes the actual mechanical and biological behavior of the early embryo. When the blastocyst implants into the uterine wall, it literally acts like a parasite.
It burrows in.
It burrows into the endometrial lining and establishes a vascular connection to siphon nutrients directly from the mother's blood supply. It is functionally behaving exactly like a leech. And visually, if you look at a microscopic embryo at this 24-day stage, it physically resembles a leech.
A microscopic visual description from a time with no microscopes. What's the next stage?
The text says the alaka becomes a mudga, which translates to a chewed-like lump. Again, if you look at a 28-day-old embryo under a microscope, it develops these structures called somites, which will eventually become the vertebrae and muscles.
And they look chewed.
These somites look exactly like teeth marks. The embryo visually resembles a piece of gum that has been chewed and indented by teeth. From there, the text accurately sequences the formation of bones, followed by the clothing of those bones with intact flesh or muscle.
And this leads to the central, unavoidable question the source material is asking the listener to confront. It's an argument of sheer statistical probability. The lecturer asks, if this text was written by a human being, a man in the 7th century, wouldn't he have naturally incorporated the erroneous scientific theories of his time?
It is intellectually inevitable. We all breathe the intellectual air of our era. If you ask a 19th century sci-fi writer to imagine the future, they will imagine steam-powered spaceships, because steam is the limit of their technological paradigm.
Exactly.
If the Quran were a human author simply gathering the best available medical knowledge of the 7th century, we would absolutely see Aristotle's cheese coagulation theory or Galen's anatomical errors permanently cemented into the text.
The absolute absence of a single scientific error in these biological descriptions, coupled with the presence of verified microscopic facts, is presented by the lecturer not just as a historical curiosity, but as hard statistical proof.
It's an argument for a non-human omniscient author. The data points simply do not map to the capabilities of a 7th century human mind. It's like digging up an ancient Egyptian tomb and finding a perfectly functioning silicon microchip sitting next to a mummy. The technological context completely contradicts the artifact.
And what's truly brilliant is how the text utilizes this scientific data. It doesn't just passively list facts about embryos and orbits to show off.
No, it uses them.
It actively uses these scientific realities to execute a massive socio-economic and cultural critique. It uses the physical universe to challenge our very definition of what it means to be a scholar or to hold authority.
Which brings us to the final, and I think most truly provocative argument of the lecture. The text shifts focus to geology and zoology, but it weaponizes them against traditional hierarchies.
Let's look at how it does this. The text directs human attention to the mountains. It specifically highlights the stratification of rock formations, mentioning the distinct streaks in the mountains, white, red, and intensely black.
And then it points to the immense biological and genetic diversity of colors and temperaments in animals, livestock, and human beings.
It's asking the reader to observe mineral deposits, geology, and genetic diversity. But why? What is the logical conclusion the text draws from this observation?
It builds to a very specific, devastating conclusion. After describing the mountains, the rain cycle, and biological diversity, the verse concludes with a powerful statement. It says that, of all human beings, only the ulema truly stand in reverence and awe of the Creator.
Okay, we need to pause here and define ulema, because this is where the paradigm shift happens. What does that word mean historically?
Etymologically, ulema simply translates to those with knowledge or the scholars. But historically, and this is a historical tragedy of terminology, the lecturer points out, in the centuries following the text's revelation, the title ulema was co-opted almost entirely by religious clerics.
Right. If you memorized volumes of theology, if you debated the nuances of jurisprudence, if you sat in a mosque and issued legal decrees, you were the ulema. You were the officially recognized scholar.
But the lecturer forces us to look at the actual, literal context of the verse. The verse does not say, those who memorize legal texts and debate philosophy stand in awe. What was the text just talking about in the preceding sentences?
It was just talking about rock stratifications, the hydrological water cycle, and zoological diversity.
Exactly. So based on the literal grammatical context of the text itself, who are the true ulema?
The scientists.
Yes. The true ulema are the geologists, the biologists, the astrophysicists, the botanists, the people who are actually out in the field.
Wow.
The researcher looking at the streaks in the mountains through a mass spectrometer, the geneticist studying the DNA sequencing of animals, the astrophysicist peering through the James Webb telescope at the orbital momentum of stars. The text is explicitly defining the true scholar as the one who investigates the physical systems of the universe.
I absolutely love how the lecturer points this out. It is such a sharp, almost humorous critique of traditional religious structures.
It really is.
He's essentially saying you have these traditional clerics sitting in closed, windowless rooms, aggressively ignoring science, debating abstract ancient philosophy, and they have the audacity to think they are the ulema. But by ignoring the physical universe, by ignoring the mountains and the rain, They are missing the entire point of the text.
Meanwhile, the secular scientist, the researcher in the laboratory, who might not even claim any religious affiliation, but who is painstakingly uncovering the mechanics of a cellular division or the physics of a black hole. That scientist is actually fulfilling the text's mandate to seek perceptual knowledge.
They are the ones actually looking at the evidence the text demanded we look at. The pursuit of empirical science is elevated to the highest possible form of scholarship.
And this ties perfectly back to where we started, back to verse 27.60 and the law of requital, what the lecture calls mukafat An-Naml, the idea that false claims to authority will inevitably collapse under the weight of reality.
Yes, the synthesis of the entire lecture is profoundly elegant. 27.60 is the philosophical spine of everything we've talked about. The text uses the physical universe to prove a political and structural point.
It asks the pharaohs, the kings, the monopolies, did you build the water cycle? Did you invent the biological cell? When the answer is no, it exposes their authority as a fraud.
The specific systems being claimed might change across history. Maybe in the 7th century it was a claim over a river, and in the 21st century it's a claim over data infrastructure or algorithmic systems. But the fraudulent nature of the claim remains the same.
Because they are conflating their partial control of a system with the total authority of having created the system. They are committing the ultimate error of Yadolun.
Exactly. The text demonstrates its own authority by proving it understands the mechanics of the universe, for the vacuum of space to the somites of an embryo, better than the greatest human minds of antiquity. And it uses that unimpeachable scientific authority to dismantle illegitimate human power structures.
It says, look at the actual mechanics of reality. Now look at the people claiming to rule you. Notice the gap.
Okay, let's take a breath and review the massive amount of ground we've covered today. This has been an absolute intellectual journey.
A total paradigm shift.
We started with the assumption that ancient texts are just poetry, and completely shattered that by looking at the crisis of evidence faced by a modern generation demanding empirical proof.
We saw how Dr. Maurice Bucaille applied unforgiving scientific criteria to the Quran, discovering a text devoid of the expected historical errors. We looked at the extreme danger of the translation trap, where human bias obscures original meanings.
We analyzed how the ancient Arabic root Yazbahan flawlessly describes the internal kinetic momentum of celestial orbits, long before astrophysics even had a word for it. We explored how the text perfectly predicts the sensory disorientation, the intoxication, and the absolute darkness of leaving the Earth's atmosphere.
We unpacked the grammar of possibility, the critical distinction between the impossible law and the possible, in revealing a text that viewed space travel not as a myth, but as a future engineering reality requiring the immense concentrated physical force of Sultan.
We marveled at the microscopic accuracy of embryological descriptions, the alaka and mugga, that utterly defied the flawed consensus of ancient philosophers like Aristotle.
And finally, we saw how the text executes a massive socio-economic critique. It redefines the very concept of a scholar, stripping the title of ulema from the isolated cleric and handing it directly to the scientist, the geologist, the biologist, who actually studies the mechanics of the universe.
It exposes the illegitimacy of those who claim authority over productive systems they didn't build.
So what impact of all this? Why does a lecture from 1987 analyzing a 7th century text matter to you today, right now?
It matters because it challenges you to fundamentally overhaul how you interact with information in ancient texts. It warns us not to let outdated translations or traditionalist gatekeepers trap profound, forward-thinking concepts in the past.
It suggests that true intellectual reverence isn't found in blind, unquestioning faith, but in the rigorous, empirical pursuit of understanding physical reality. It elevates the pursuit of science from a secular chore to a deeply profound civilizational endeavor.
It bridges the laboratory and the library. It proves that perceptual knowledge is the only valid pathway to conceptual truth. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive is over.
We've seen how a text from the 7th century contains incredibly precise scientific realities about orbital momentum, space vacuums, and microscopic embryos that took humanity 1,400 years of relentless technological advancement to verify.
If that is the case, what other truths, what other blueprints for reality or socioeconomic survival are currently hidden in plain sight within these linguistic time capsules? What concepts are just sitting there waiting for our technology, our linguistics, and our societal maturity to finally catch up and decode them?
It makes you wonder, what is the next word we will finally understand?
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Keep questioning, keep demanding the evidence, and whatever you do, keep looking up at the stars.